Hey everyone, it's Ryan. It's been a while since I've done one of these videos, and I want to talk about Kyle Rittenhouse and the tragic events that happened in Kenosha, Wisconsin. Um, Importantly, I want to talk about some of the common arguments that I've been hearing, both in Facebook and all social media in general, and some of the big misconceptions, even straight up lies that have been said. Most of the facts that I'm going to bring up are facts that were discovered during um, the evidence and the testimony in the court case. So it's not just, me just cherry picking off of websites here and there to form an opinion. And at the very end, I am going to give my personal opinion as to what I think about this. As we all know, I'm a very pro Second Amendment person, but I'm also don't like violence a whole hell of a lot. I think things should be handled better, but we'll get to that at the end. One of the big complaints or lies that I've heard is that Mr. Rittenhouse had no stakes in Kenosha, that he traveled from Illinois as kind of a terrorist junkie and stuff like that. It was the claim that he was looking for a fight. Um, Kyle has family in Kenosha. His father lives there. His grandmother on his father's side lives there. And a bunch of the family from his father's side live in Kenosha and the surrounding areas. So he did have a stake in Kenosha. It wasn't just, or it wasn't, it is understandable that he had a stake in the protest and the civil unrest that had been going through America in Kenosha. Um, Another one that I see a whole lot is that it was a peaceful protest. Protest of a young man that was shot and killed by police uh, in the Black Lives Matter movement. Apparently was at the protest, which yes, in the beginning it was, and like many other peaceful protests that happened throughout the country, it devolved into violence and riots about the time that the curfew came through. Um, at that point, there was multiple arsons. There was gunfire throughout, not just Mr. Rittenhouse's gunfire, but there was gunfire. There was fights. There was people instigating stuff like that. I think one of the important parts to point out is that Mr. Joseph Rosenbaum and Mr. Joshua Zeminski, who I'll talk about later, were both witnessed lighting the dumpster fire that you see in one of the videos. Um, the fire that I believe Mr. Rittenhouse grabbed the extinguisher to try and put out, which is kind of step one, or one of the earlier steps, if not step one, of the night's events that ended up in the death of two men and injury of a third. Um, there was no need to be armed, and that Mr. Rittenhouse being armed kind of provoked others to action and whatnot. Joshua Minsky was also armed. He fired off several shots towards Mr. Rittenhouse into the air as warning shots 3 seconds before Mr. Rittenhouse shot Joseph Rosenbaum. There's multiple gunshots that you hear throughout the videos, but those shots happened directly before Rittenhouse ever pulled a trigger. Gage Grossenkreutz, I always screw up his last name, I apologize. He was the one that was shot in the arm. He had a Glock pistol and an expired concealed carry license prior to being shot. He even testified that he pulled the weapon and aimed it at Mr. Rittenhouse prior to being shot when he was attempting to disarm. Him and Mr. Anthony Huber were trying to disarm Kyle. As we know, Mr. Anthony Huber actually was shot and killed. Um, there was no need for Rittenhouse to be armed at all. As I pointed out here, there was multiple people armed throughout the protest on both sides, which there's a lot of debate whether you should be allowed to carry at protests. There are several areas in the U.S. where it's illegal to carry during a protest, regardless of what side of the protest you happen to be on. But it's not like what you see in the media that Mr. Rittenhouse was the only one armed, or what was described as the Boogaloo Boys were the only ones armed. People were armed on all sides of this protest, and while we don't know who fired the very first shots, we can say definitively from the video that Mr. Zeminski did fire 3 seconds before Rosenbaum opened fire on, or not Rosenbaum, Mr. Rittenhouse fired on Mr. Rosenbaum. That Kyle's, another thing that we see a whole lot is Kyle's simply being there with a rifle provoked these actions. As I said, there was a lot of violence going on. There was fires being set and whatnot, and I do not believe, and I don't believe the videos show that people were lighting the fires because Kyle Rittenhouse was there or any of the other armed gentlemen that were protecting buildings. It doesn't show that that's why they were setting the fires. As I said, there was multiple protests that devolved into riots throughout America in the months following up to this particular protest that just devolved into riots. So I believe it's, according to the evidence, it's believable that these acts will have happened with or without Mr. Rittenhouse being there. So let's go into my opinions. The other facts right now is that the jury is still out. No determinations have been made yet. The defense has filed for a mistrial with prejudice, which from my understanding means if it granted with prejudice means that the trial cannot be retried, as opposed to just a normal mistrial where we go back to step one and the whole court case restarts if the prosecutors want to restart it. Did Mr. Rittenhouse, should he have been there? That's neither here nor there. As I said, there was multiple protests turned into riots, and untold damage and injuries and suffering happened before this case. This was probably the natural next step of what was going to happen, whether it happened in Kenosha or if it happened in Detroit or if it happened in Los Angeles or wherever. I believe that somebody was going to be armed and somebody was going to shoot someone else eventually, and it's a tragedy. It's unnecessary. Did Mr. Rittenhouse have the right to defend himself? Was Zeminski firing first, firing shots above his head? Absolutely. And anyone would have thought, I'm under attack, turned around, and when he did turn around, he saw Mr. Rosenbaum charging him. Whether Mr. Rosenbaum was charging him to disarm him or charging him to assault him, either way, gunshots, man charging you, most any reasonable person would have fired and would have reasonably believed that their life was in danger. As far as self-defense, when it comes to Anthony Hoover and Gage, I'm not going to try his last name again. Mr. Hoover actually struck him with a skateboard while he was down on the ground. It was kind of a grazing hit him on the shoulder, which is very much assault at that point, or battery at that point. And then Gage was approaching with a weapon drawn, and he even said in his testimony with intent to disarm or even fire on Mr. Rittenhouse. So Mr. Rittenhouse pulling his or pointing his weapon up and shooting Mr. Huber in the chest after he got hit by the skateboard, and then in that split second seeing a pistol while the other guy, Gage, was coming down at him and firing on both of them. I believe even a reasonable person who just got hit and sees a handgun and fires would also recently be a defensive action. I can see most anyone else in that scenario having those reactions. Do I really think that these Boogaloo Boys and Mr. Rittenhouse should have been posted everywhere on roofs and whatnot with firearms? We've seen something similar with the roof Koreans during the LA riots. I'm not saying it's right. What I'm saying is I understand. When things keep devolving, do I think Black Lives Matter was the cause of this? No, not at all. I believe that there's a large number of people in America that just look for an excuse to cause trouble, and this is one more excuse that they use. I think the peaceful protest that was Black Lives Matter was absolutely justified to be out there talking about what's been going on with what they believe to be police brutality and unjustified killings of multiple people based solely on skin color. That's how Black Lives Matter looks at it. Some of those cases absolutely were not justified shootings and are absolute tragedies, and the full extent of the law should take those officers and put them in prison. But I believe that when the curfew basically affects in this protest and other ones, the actual protesters, the peaceful ones, leave for the most part and go home because what they're allowed to do is done. The people that remain after curfew, I firmly believe, while they may be protesters prior, they want to cause trouble and they become rioters once they start destroying stuff and setting shit on fire and getting in fights with local law enforcement. I don't believe those people represent BLM in the slightest. I don't believe those people are peaceful protesters in the slightest. I think they are rioters at that point. I believe that these Boogaloo Boys, along with Mr. Rittenhouse, should have observed the curfew and also left, because that's why the curfew is there. They should have left with the peaceful protesters, and you can't use a firearm to defend property. Plain and simple. You're killing someone over property, and that's not okay. Or you're attempting to intimidate or kill over property. But once you believe that your life or the life of those around you is in danger of great bodily harm or death, that's when it becomes self-defense. And the threshold for that is particularly low. As long as a reasonable person would believe that they are being threatened, that's enough for it to become self-defense. And as I said, when Zeminski was firing and he turned around and Rosenbaum was barreling down on him, that absolutely any reasonable person would have seen that as a threat and defended themselves. Having tripped in the middle of the road just to be whacked with a skateboard and had a pistol drawn on him still would have been a self-defensive shooting. One of the things that I see cited fairly often is Breonna Taylor. Breonna, I can't remember her last name. She was a black woman that was asleep in her apartment when the police swatted her apartment incorrectly, and her boyfriend, which I believe was, his last name's Walker, returned fire at the police thinking that there was a home invasion. He was absolutely justified. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. Armed gunman coming into the apartment while him and his girlfriend are sleeping, and he pulls a firearm and fires. Unfortunately, Brianna was killed in that action. Um, Her family received a settlement outside of court, which I believe was so the police department didn't have to admit to shit, avoided a court case, which is absolutely asinine. And then Mr. Walker, I believe, um, has several cases against the city going on, and he even received some money at some point um, from the government due to the gross negligence of that case. So it's not to say that these things aren't happening. They absolutely are, and the government and the police need to absolutely be held accountable for these types of actions, such as Breonna Taylor. Um, but allowing vigilantes is not the way to go. It really isn't. Destroying cities is absolutely not the way to go. Smashing in a CVS has nothing to do with um, with protesting someone's right to still be living. It's just rioting. Setting cars on fire and whatnot is not a way to honor someone who was killed unjustly. It doesn't serve that purpose. That's just rioting. Now burning down the courthouse, taking over a police department. Those seem more aimed at who the actual perpetrators would be in those cases. Um, but busting up a Target, um, or lighting a dumpster on fire and rolling it down the streets, those don't honor the victims in any way, shape, or form. They don't. Um, we as a society need to get our shit together if we want to see change in police procedures, if we want to see change in our government, if we want to see change, we need to band together and make the change happen. And I don't just mean walking down the street with a cardboard sign. We need to start voting people out. We need to start getting people in office that can make change, to fall in line with society. Hell, look at Athens, Tennessee, back in the 1940s. There was a rapid corruption going on in the government, and a bunch of World War II vets said, "We're done with it." And they stood up and actually did something about it and proved the corruption, and got that whole government kicked the hell out, and in place a honest government that was voted into office. And yeah, they did it violently, but they did it right. They had everything in the world to prove what was going on. So those are my opinions. Those are the facts that I've commonly been hearing. A lot of the arguments I've been hearing about this case, and I would not be shocked if this kid walks. I would not be shocked if there's multiple civil suits that follow, especially the survivors of each of these, the surviving family members of each of these people that were shot and injured or killed. I don't see a whole lot of them flying either. There will be a whole lot of character assassinations going on. Everyone pointing either Mr. Rittenhouse as a villain or pointing Mr. Rosenbaum, Mr. Huber, Gage as villains. It's going to happen, and there's going to be a lot of misinformation. So look at the court documents and see the shit that's been testified to, stuff that's been admitted. Those are the best piece of information that you can use when having any of these debates on who was right, who was wrong. Stay safe out there. Be kind to each other. I'll talk to you guys later.